Sir, I told you already, this is not a shelter. We have paying guests here. The voice of the hotel manager, Richard Calloway, was laced with condescension as he looked down at the disheveled man standing at the lobby's check-in desk. The man's clothes were wrinkled, his hair slightly unkempt, and his sneakers scuffed. His heavy duffel bag, worn at the seams, only reinforced Richard's assumption. He was just another homeless man trying to get in. The elegant lobby of the five-star Crestmore Grand Hotel in New York was a stark contrast to the man's appearance. Chandeliers gleamed overhead, the scent of fresh lilies filled the air, and affluent guests passed by, some glancing disapprovingly at the scene unfolding at the front desk. The man, unfazed by Richard's harsh tone, calmly pulled out his phone. "I'd like to book a suite." Richard scoffed, crossing his arms. "Sir, a room at this hotel costs more than your—" "Well, never mind, but trust me, you can't afford it. I'll have to ask you to leave before security steps in." A few guests nearby chuckled quietly, while others turned away, uncomfortable with the tension. The man tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Then, he simply swiped on his phone and turned the screen toward Richard. The moment Richard's eyes landed on it, his face drained of color. It was the Forbes website, and staring back at him was the same homeless man, only in a crisp suit, grinning with a headline beneath his name, "Tech billionaire Nathaniel Royce makes Forbes' top 10 entrepreneurs list." Richard's breath hitched as his eyes darted between the Forbes article on the phone screen and the man standing in front of him. Nathaniel Royce. The name alone sent a jolt of panic through him. Nathaniel Royce wasn't just some tech entrepreneur. He was a billionaire, a self-made giant in the AI industry, rumored to be launching a new project that could revolutionize global commerce. His face had been splashed across business magazines, television interviews, and even conference panels alongside some of the world's wealthiest individuals. And yet, Richard had just insulted him. The silence in the lobby grew deafening. A few guests who had overheard the confrontation were now whispering among themselves, some of them discreetly looking up Nathaniel Royce on their phones. Richard swallowed hard. "Mr. Royce, Nathaniel tucked his phone back into his pocket and studied Richard with a calm, unreadable expression. "Let me guess," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge. "Now that you know my net worth, you suddenly have a suite available?" Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. The arrogance he had displayed just seconds ago had evaporated. He was trapped in a situation he couldn't talk his way out of. "Sir, I sincerely apologize," Richard stammered, his palms sweating. We would be honored to have you as our guest. Please allow me to personally escort you to our presidential suite." "Complimentary, of course." Nathaniel let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Interesting," he mused. "A moment ago, I wasn't good enough to step foot in this place. Now, you're practically rolling out the red carpet." Richard's face turned a shade of crimson. "I didn't realize who you were, sir. It was a misunderstanding." Nathaniel's eyes darkened slightly. "No, it wasn't. You judged me by my appearance. You assumed I was homeless, and worse, you enjoyed the idea of throwing me out." Richard stiffened, realizing just how deep a hole he had dug for himself. Before he could utter another excuse, Nathaniel turned to the stunned receptionist behind the desk. "Please check me in, and let your general manager know. I'd like a word." The receptionist, looking as flustered as Richard, nodded quickly and began typing away on the computer. Richard, meanwhile, felt his stomach twist into knots. He knew this was going to cost him. He just didn't know how much. Richard stood frozen, his mind racing with ways to salvage the situation. But there was no way out. Nathaniel Royce now held all the power. As the receptionist hastily completed the check-in, Nathaniel leaned casually against the counter, his sharp gaze never leaving Richard. "So, tell me, Mr. Calloway," he said smoothly, "is this how you treat all guests who don't fit your expectations? Or am I just special?" Richard forced an awkward laugh. "Sir, I assure you, Save it." Nathaniel's tone was cold. "You made your judgment the moment you saw me, and you were more than happy to humiliate me in front of everyone." Several guests had gathered, watching the scene unfold with interest. The tension in the lobby was thick enough to cut with a knife. Just then, a tall man in a navy blue suit approached. His name tag read Christopher Warren, General Manager. His eyes flicked between Richard and Nathaniel, sensing something was very wrong. Mr. Royce, Christopher said with a warm smile, extending his hand. It's an honor to have you with us. I just heard you wanted to speak with me. Nathaniel shook his hand but didn't return the smile. Yes, your front desk manager here, he motioned toward Richard, thought it would be a good idea to judge a guest based on appearances. He was ready to throw me out. But now that he knows who I am, he's tripping over himself to make it right. Christopher's jaw tightened, and he turned to Richard, his expression unreadable. Is that true? Richard opened his mouth, but no excuse came. I'd like to know, Nathaniel continued, how many people have been treated like this before me? How many hard-working, decent people have walked into this hotel and been insulted, humiliated, or turned away because they didn't look the part? Christopher looked visibly uncomfortable. Mr. Royce, I can assure you that we hold our staff to the highest standards. Oh, really? Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. Then why did this happen? Christopher exhaled sharply. He turned back to Richard, his face a mask of cold professionalism. Mr. Calloway, my office. Now, Richard's stomach dropped. Nathaniel smiled slightly. Oh, don't worry. I'll be joining you. After all, I'm curious to hear how this place handles situations like these. Richard's face was pale as he followed Christopher and Nathaniel toward the manager's office. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew it wasn't going to be good. The office was eerily silent as Richard sat stiffly in the chair across from Christopher Warren's polished mahogany desk. Nathaniel Royce stood by the window, gazing out at the city skyline, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn-out jacket. A jacket that, just moments ago, had made Richard assume he was a homeless nobody. Christopher shut the door behind him and took his seat, exhaling sharply. Mr. Royce, first of all, let me personally apologize for what happened. This is not the kind of experience we want any guest to have at our hotel. Nathaniel turned, his sharp eyes locking onto Christopher. Then tell me, Mr. Warren, what exactly are you going to do about it? Christopher cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably. Well, I assure you, disciplinary action will be taken. He shot a look at Richard, who sat frozen, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. Richard has been with us for years, but clearly, his behavior today was unacceptable. I will handle this internally. Nathaniel crossed his arms. Internally? So, in other words, a slap on the wrist? Richard's face went pale. Christopher hesitated. Mr. Royce, if you have a specific course of action in mind, I'd be happy to consider it. Nathaniel let out a short chuckle and took a step forward. I do. He turned to Richard, his expression unreadable. Tell me, Mr. Calloway, have you ever been homeless? Richard swallowed hard. No, sir. Nathaniel smirked. Didn't think so. You probably never had to sleep in a car, never had to wonder where your next meal was coming from. Never had people judge you just for existing. Richard lowered his gaze, his face burning with shame. Nathaniel leaned down slightly, his voice calm but firm. I used to be homeless, Calloway. The words hit like a slap. Richard's eyes shot up. What? Nathaniel straightened, watching Richard's stunned reaction. Years ago, before my first company took off, I had nothing. No family, no safety net, just a backpack and a dream. And I remember every single person who looked at me the way you did today, like I was worthless. Silence filled the office. Richard felt his throat tighten. He had misjudged the man so terribly that the weight of his mistake crushed him like a landslide. Nathaniel sighed. So here's what I want. Fire him. Richard's heart slammed against his ribs. Please, sir, Nathaniel held up a hand. Not permanently, but I want him to understand what it's like to be on the other side. Christopher furrowed his brow. What exactly are you suggesting? Nathaniel's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. For 1 week, I want Richard to step into the shoes of the people he looks down on. No cushy office, no expensive suits. Let him work in a shelter, serve meals, and see what it's like to be treated as invisible. Richard felt the room spinning. You can't be serious. Nathaniel arched a brow. Why not? If you really believe the way you treat people is fair, then this shoe. The next morning, Richard Calloway stood outside Hope Haven Shelter, staring at the rundown building with a mix of dread and disbelief. The faded sign above the door was barely legible, and a few people lingered outside. Some bundled in tattered coats, others sitting on the curb, their eyes filled with exhaustion. He adjusted his tie, then stopped himself. No more suits. Nathaniel had made sure of that. Instead, Richard wore a simple polo shirt and jeans, looking far less like the high-ranking hotel manager he once was. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of cheap coffee and disinfectant. Volunteers bustled around, serving meals, organizing supplies, and speaking to guests. A short, no-nonsense woman in her late 50s approached him. Her name tag read, Linda, Shelter Supervisor. She eyed him skeptically. "You must be the guy doing his punishment week," she said bluntly. Richard's face burned. "It's more of an educational experience," Linda snorted. "Sure, we'll see how long you last." She handed him a stained apron. "You're on kitchen duty. Hope you're not afraid to get your hands dirty." Richard swallowed his pride and followed her to the serving area. A long line of people had already formed, waiting patiently for a hot meal. People he would have once ignored on the street. Linda handed him a ladle. "Start serving." He hesitated for a fraction of a second before scooping mashed potatoes onto a tray. The man receiving it, a thin, weary-looking veteran, mumbled a quiet thank you before shuffling away. Richard nodded stiffly. The line kept moving. A woman with a young child stepped forward. The boy, no older than 6, clutched his mother's hand tightly, his eyes scanning the food with cautious excitement. Richard paused. A child? He had never once considered that homelessness affected kids. But as he handed over their trays, the mother gave him a grateful look that made something tighten in his chest. This wasn't just some social experiment. This was real life. And for the first time, Richard Calloway began to understand just how little he truly knew. By the 3rd day, Richard's feet ached, his back was sore, and his hands were raw from washing endless trays. But something inside him had started to change. He listened to their stories. The single father who had lost his job, the elderly woman who couldn't afford her medical bills, the teenager who had aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. They weren't lazy. They weren't failures. They were people who had been dealt a bad hand. One night, after the dinner shift, Richard sat on the shelter steps, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. "You surviving, Calloway?" He turned to see Nathaniel standing beside him, hands in his pockets. Richard let out a breath. "I get it now." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" Richard nodded slowly. "I used to think people like them ended up here because they made bad choices. But it's not that simple. A lost job, a medical emergency, one mistake, and suddenly your whole life crumbles." Nathaniel studied him for a long moment, then smirked. "Well, what do you know? Maybe you can learn." Richard let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, well, learning hurts." Nathaniel patted him on the shoulder. "Good, that means it's working." By the end of the week, Richard was no longer the same man who had sneered at a homeless guest in his hotel lobby. As he stood outside Hope Haven Shelter for the last time, Linda handed him a slip of paper. "What's this?" he asked. "Your next shift schedule," she said with a wink. "Something tells me you'll be back." Richard glanced at Nathaniel, who grinned. For the first time in his life, Richard smiled back, because he knew she was right. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.